think firstly, a very warm welcome, right? Particularly those people who are from outside the university. It's always especially welcome to see visitors who come along to events like this. Now, the topic of tonight's lecture is obviously technical and professional education, and it's one of those areas that's very close to my heart. So I was delighted when I approached Professor John Diamond to invite Olly along here, that he said yes. So I'm particularly pleased that it's one of the I4P lectures that's taking place over this particular term. Now, Olly is Director of Policy and Research at the Edge Foundation, which is an independent educational charity that actually promotes technical and professional education. And Olly's role within that is to find out what works, right, within technical and practical education, and to provide policymakers and the media with the latest information on those areas to make sure that they are really making informed decisions about what the right way forward is for technical education. And Olly is also, in the past, before being seconded to the Edge Foundation, he was Director of Apprenticeship Strategy at the Department for Education. So in that sense, he's ideally situated to be able to speak about this evening's topic. So,
great.
Olly. All right, Olly.
That's wonderful. Perfect. It was really nice to see everyone. So I'll be talking about technical education, which is one of my passions. So I'm really happy to be here this evening. As Paul's touched on already, my last 10 years have been spent in the education department. So I'm to blame for most things. I worked on academies to start with. I was Alan Johnson's private secretary for a short time. And then the most recently, the last sort of 5 or 6 years, I've been working on policy related to teenagers, young people NEET to start with, and then most recently on apprenticeships. The last time I was in this neck of the woods was over in Preston at the BAE factory during National Apprenticeship Week, which was one of my jobs to organise last year. And it was a bit of a surreal experience. If anyone likes the thick of it, it was a bit like that moment, because I arrived and the PM was due to be speaking in front of a sort of horseshoe of apprentices. You know, you can sort of imagine the cheesy type media, you know, shiny apprentices in the background, PM in the foreground. And as I arrived, all of his sort of minders were talking up their sleeves and kept mentioning a giant chicken. And I thought, surely they must be, maybe it's code for something, but it was genuinely, the Daily Mail had got somebody standing outside the gates dressed as a giant chicken. I think it was when there was a potentially backing down on Trident. Anyway, they had to divert the PM's car to make sure that the media couldn't get a clear photo of him with the chicken. So anyway, so that was the last time I was in the area. So hopefully this time will be a bit more serious. As Paul's mentioned, I've now moved to the Edge Foundation. That's a really nice move for me, because it means I can start to speak my mind, which is lovely. Use some of the stuff that I've learned in policy making over the last 10 years, but have the freedom to sort of develop that a bit more and highlight, I guess, the things that do and don't work. And that's one of the things I want to talk about today. So 4 things I want to touch on today. The first is to look at a bit of the history of technical professional education over the last 20 years through 3 lenses, really, through looking at 14 to 19 policy, through looking at careers guidance policy, and then through looking a bit at apprenticeships as well, which is obviously an area that's particularly close to my heart. I'd like to give you a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at how policy is made, so looking at a case study around the development of the public sector duty for apprenticeships and how that came about. I'd like to say a bit about why I think policy making doesn't work and the things that are a challenge, and then a bit about what the solutions might be. So I'll talk for about 45 minutes and then plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So looking at the first of those, so the sort of history of technical education policy over the last sort of 20 years, there are so many different strands of this that you could spend all day talking about funding or international elements, and really the 3 I've picked out are because I think they are useful ways of useful lenses, I guess, at looking at the policy changing, but also they're useful because they illustrate some of the things that can go right and wrong with policy making more generally. So the first of those is 14 to 19. So during the sort of late 1980s, early 1990s, we started to see the development of a dialogue around the 14 to 19 age group, particularly through the development of the Technical and Vocational Education Initiative. But it wasn't really until sort of 2002, 2004 that the government sort of alighted on this and commissioned Mike Tomlinson to develop a report with his committee into what the future of technical and professional education should be. I was looking again at some of the recommendations from that, because probably the thing that I've heard most in coming into this job when I talk to people about missed opportunities in the last 20 years was Tomlinson. People keep coming back to it. People keep telling me that you know, it still holds true, a lot of it, and that there's opportunities there. So just to touch on some of the things that were said there. So the key aim was really to think about replacing what are currently GCSEs, A-levels and vocational education with a single set of qualifications. And interestingly, Tomlinson recommended doing that over a 10-year window. When have government ever suggested doing something over a 10-year window? It's always 2 years or 3 years. So that as a starter is a really sensible suggestion. This is going to take time to develop. Replacing coursework with a single extended project, and actually, as I come on to talk about the diplomas, there's some of those still there, some background there. The idea was to create a diploma that would come at 4 levels: at entry, so pre-GCSE, at foundation, equivalent to GCSE, at intermediate, sort of top end of GCSE, and then at advanced, which would be sort of A-level standard. Students would be able to progress at their own rate, so this was pretty revolutionary, mixed age classes depending on where you've got to with progress rather than necessarily based on your age. And then the ability for advanced level students to pick up harder questions, so stretch through that extended project to get the sort of highest grades. And a bit like the International Baccalaureate, that diploma would have a single certificate at the end that would be your passing out, but would list the different components so that an employer or a university would be able to see which elements you succeeded most strongly in. So having commissioned that report, the government got a bit scared. This seemed quite radical, too radical in fact, particularly the bits about GCSE and A-level being moved into this, and particularly the bits about mixed age classes. That was too big a jump. What they ended up was a bit of a political fudge, really, the 14 to 19 diplomas. Now, I have these hold a sort of positive part in my heart because I worked on them at the time, and there was a lot of good from them. So some of the things that I think came out of them really strongly was the level of collaboration was really, really effective. So talking to a head teacher I know who was a head down in Bristol at the time, and worked a lot with the aviation industry down there and several of the schools and colleges. For him, this was the first time that those schools, colleges and employers had really come together for a common purpose and really felt that they were part of the same thing in developing and delivering that. And that's become a bit of a theme through technical education as we come on to talk about apprenticeships in a bit, this idea that employer involvement, employer engagement might be a sort of critical element. Similarly, talking to a head teacher last week in Lincoln of a very high-performing school. Interestingly, people, as we all know, people tend to have the sort of natural thought that academic is for the best and technical is for those who can't. Obviously, that's something that we're trying to very much address and sort of push back on. But a head teacher of a very high-performing school saying that what his kids needed, particularly the high-performing ones who are interested in engineering, was that diploma, and he really rued the day that was taken away. So, as I've said, one of the key elements of that diploma development was that collaboration. And I was over in Northern Ireland last November, and it's interesting to see there they have kept on something similar to this. So they have what they call a balanced entitlement, basically an entitlement of young people at every school to access all of 29 lines of learning. So essentially what it means is that it forces institutions to collaborate because no one school or college can deliver all of those. So there's a natural motivation in the system for schools and colleges to work together in a way that they don't currently here. So diplomas were developed, a huge amount of work, a huge amount of money. I'm not sure there's been a calculation of the amount of money that went into it, but it would be scary if you divided it by the number of diplomas that were actually taken. But nonetheless, diplomas were developed. They started in 2008, but with the arrival of the coalition government in 2010, the programme was entirely stopped. And it was really interesting to see that level of shock that the government would simply put a stopper on that. And I think that has stuck around with a lot of people in this area, and particularly employers who were involved, because they put an awful lot of their own capital into developing those. And so when they see an initiative come up now, be that apprenticeship standards or the new T-levels, always in the back of their mind is the thought that even if this looks like it's really the next thing, even if you put in hundreds of hours of time, there could be a situation where the government changes or the policy changes and it just simply comes to a full stop. So I think that the repercussions of that have been larger even than the removal of diplomas, because it's created a sort of level of distrust in the system of new initiatives. So having got rid of that new curriculum through the diplomas, interestingly that new government retained one key element of the policy, which again happened to be something I was working on at the time, which was raising the participation age. So increasing the age at which young people had to stay on in some form of education to 17 in 2013 and then to 18 in 2015. But interestingly, in doing that, in keeping the raising of the participation age but removing the technical element, in a way they opened up the system to misinterpreting this as raising the school leaving age, which a lot of parents, a lot of students, a lot of schools still misinterpret this as, partly because it's convenient because it fills school sixth forms. But it's interesting that they raised the participation age, you have to stay on in some form of education, but by removing that universal diploma entitlement, effectively the sort of default option became school. In those years since 2010, I think the biggest change and the biggest focus around the 14 to 19 curriculum has been the focus on increased rigor. And that's been a word that increasingly education secretaries and education ministers have come back to. And I think there's two key elements to that. The first is the creation of the English Baccalaureate, the EBAC, first as a performance measure and then more recently as a target of 90% of pupils in English schools taking it. The EBAC is quite a narrow range of academic subjects, 2 English, maths, 2 sciences, English or geography, and then a foreign language. Although the rhetoric of government holds true that if you're a higher performing young person and you're taking perhaps 9 or 10 GCSEs, you can supplement that with creative and technical education. If you're a lower attaining young person and in the lowest quartile, you'd typically be taking 6 or 7 GCSEs, that effectively becomes your whole curriculum. And so you get this ironic situation where for those who are most likely to disengage, they're being force-fed the most academic diet and not having the opportunity to take part in creative, technical, sports subjects that might motivate them and help them to find the rationale and the reason for English and maths and the other core subjects. The other element of that focus on rigour was Alison Wolf's work. Now, Alison Wolf uncovered a situation where some of the sort of smaller technical qualifications were of relatively little value in the labour market, or in fact, in some cases, scarily, they were of negative value. So by taking that course, you statistically made yourself less likely to be employed, which obviously was a very poor situation for those young people. I think what came out of Alison Wolf's reviews and the significant slimming down of those qualifications perhaps has gone a bit far. So the rationale was a good one, and this again is a bit of a theme of policymaking. The rationale was good, but in practice it's been slimmed to such an extent that if you talk to teachers in many schools, they say that they really don't have the choice of qualifications and areas of development that their young people need because of the way that their performance tables have changed in that respect. So I'll come back a bit more to this at the end, but one of the things that I think is a big challenge for education policy at the second, and probably the biggest thing that's holding back secondary school education, is that EBAC measure and the push for 90% of pupils in the current government to take it, although I very much hope that might change post-election. The impact of that has been felt really strongly in technical creative subjects. So there's been a 10% reduction in design and technology over the last year, coming on the back of 4 or 5 years of decline. And similarly in art subjects, so art and design a 5% fall, drama a 4% fall, and we're starting to see those subjects reaching critical mass. So the Design and Technology Association data doing some work at the moment to look at how many design and technology departments are coming to the point where they're reaching whether they can stay open or not. So a very difficult point, I think. Interestingly, given that we've just been talking about 14 to 19, I think the divide has been emerging much more strongly at 16 over recent years, and this is a real challenge to this area. So you can see this very strongly in the very latest policy thinking, which is around the Lord Sainsbury's review and the post-16 skills plan. So again, some of the logic there is sound. The idea that we might have a consolidated set of routes so that it makes it much easier for young people to choose where they want to go to. I think there's a lot of positives for that in terms of making those career decisions easier, although there are lots of challenges as well. Within the creative route, you've got things as broad as journalism and being a goldsmith. So trying to find a core curriculum that covers both of those, I think, will be tough. But nonetheless, the rationale is sound. I think doing that simply from 16 rather than from 14 is a real mistake, because it means that you get those 2 years of between 14 and 16 where young people get this purely academic diet before they're then allowed to spread their wings and look at creative and technical subjects. And that can be very demotivating. It can help them, or it prevents them from seeing the relevance of some of their work, and therefore I think can lead to real disengagement. So for me, on the 14 to 19, just to conclude that little bit, we've come on this journey from having a really strong focus on the 14 to 19 age group as a whole, to one where that was the rug was pulled from diplomas, where the development of this concept of rigour led to the reduction in the number of qualifications, and now you've seen this divide really emerge very strongly at 16, which is a real challenge. Happily, I think the pendulum's starting to swing back the other way, and people are starting to see the validity of 14 to 19 as a phase of education. I just wanted to share with you a quote from the Lord Select Committee report on social mobility last year, which very strongly recognised this. So they said transitions to work take longer for some young people, and this is not recognised in the current format of 16 to 18 or 16 to 19 education. It would be much better for the national curriculum to stop at age 14 rather than 16, and for a new 14 to 19 transition stage to be developed. So I think that idea of 14 to 19 as the preparation for work as a transition stage could be a really powerful one. Interestingly, Lord Baker, who's the chair of the charity I work for and the Baker Doing Trust, was the one who invented the national curriculum, and he now says very openly that if he had his time again, one of the things he would do was to stop it at 14 and to allow that 14 to 19 period to be a transition phase to work. So I think it's telling that even the architect of the policy now sees that as the way forward.
It's taken a long time to learn.
It has, but he's learnt it, and he's not afraid to admit that. So the second sort of theme I just wanted to look at around the careers guide, around the technical education over the last 20 years was around careers guidance, and I think this is a really good example of government policy not working, of the cyclical nature of it, so things going in and out in a very inefficient way, and of the perennial challenge for technical education, which is that things change at least every 5 years, if not sooner, and it's really hard for people to make any inroads before the policy changes. So connection services were established in 2000 as a national network of centres for advice, guidance, support for 13 to 19-year-olds. And I think what happened was, having built on that, essentially more and more responsibilities were loaded onto those connection services without any additional funding. So they became support for youth homelessness, for neat young people, for young carers, for young runaways. And at one time, when I was working on policy in the department, there were policy teams in each of those areas firing off missives to connection services and local authorities. So you ended up with what was a very core, tight model of careers guidance and support becoming something that tried to be everything to everyone. And obviously that was a real challenge for it. How did ministers try and solve that? Well, with another age-old policy trick, which was to devolve it to local authorities. So to say, oh, well, it's not working terribly well. Let's use the rhetoric of making it more focused on local areas and giving people the ability to shape it themselves. But really what they wanted to do is to put a problem at arm's length, so that if connections wasn't working, they could say, well, that's a local authority's responsibility, not ours. So that's what happened in 2008. It was devolved to local authority control, and that combination of sort of overloading responsibilities and then devolving led to another sort of recurring theme in policy, which is it became patchy. This is a favourite phrase of ministers before they close something down. It's a convenient way of talking about a service that has good bits, but also less good bits, and therefore we'll dispense with that and we'll start again or try something new. So patchy was the word that they used to describe that, and keep that in mind because it will come back in the story in a bit. So Connections was abolished as a national service, and schools were given a new responsibility to provide or secure independent careers guidance for their pupils. Now, I actually think that's a good thing. I think schools should be much more involved, and I think it works for schools to be at the centre of commissioning that, because it is the case that different schools need different things, and it is the case that local partnerships between employers and schools work better. But the problem was that there was a sleight of hand here, and whilst the duty was put on schools, there was no extra money. The Connections money, as was, £460 million, was just absorbed back in as part of the austerity drive and went back into the Treasury coffers, and none of that money went to schools. So you've got that additional responsibility on schools at a time when school budgets are already tight, but without the additional funding to support it. Now, interestingly, Ofsted have then judged careers guidance services in schools a couple of years later, and you'll be unsurprised to know that the word they used was patchy. So Ofsted said 2 years later, only 1 in 5 schools were effective in ensuring that all students were receiving the level of information they needed. So it was a real challenge even 2 or 3 years later. And then most recently, the Education and Skills Select Committee had another look at it back in 2015, and they said careers education, information, advice and guidance in English schools is patchy and often inadequate. So there's that real sort of challenge of if something is looking like it's working in some areas and not others, it gets declared patchy, and that's sort of a bit of a toxic word, I guess. Interestingly, as we think about that sort of cyclical nature, we've now seen the creation of the National Careers Service and the Careers and Enterprise Company as a way to really start to bring back in some of the things that Connections would have done in terms of centralising good practice, the ambassadors that work with schools. So again, I think we've started to see some of that creeping back in. I did a calculation the other day thinking about that money that used to go to Connections. If you took the £460 million and if you made a nominal 20% reduction to help with austerity, and then you sent that out to every secondary school in the country, every school would get an average of £105,000. So if that money had gone out, you could have had, say, 2 or 3 members of dedicated staff who were careers advisors, employer engagement officers doing that work at schools. Or if you gave schools the freedom, you could have allowed schools to band those together in a MAT or in a local authority to create a service that they commission that would work really well. So I think Connections is an interesting example of the careers education story, because it feels like there are a couple of elements or a couple of times where sleight of hand has meant that it could almost have worked. But because the money didn't follow the policy idea, or because patchiness was used as an opportunity to close something down, we lost that opportunity. So the third little theme I wanted to talk about in terms of the sort of policy history is apprenticeships. Obviously something that I am particularly keen on and sort of feel strongly about. Obviously, you could start with medieval apprenticeships if you wanted to do the full chronology. And indeed, one of the ministers I worked for, John Hayes, was a great orator and used to love, including witticisms from Chaucer about apprenticeships in his speeches. So there's a huge history here. Significant numbers right up to the 1960s. And then a period where the youth training scheme, in particular, basically killed off apprenticeships for a couple of decades. And I think that's important, not just because it meant that there was a sort of gap in the labour market where people hadn't done apprenticeships, but also because the parents of young people who were coming up to apprenticeship age in the 90s and 2000s, as we reinvigorated apprenticeships, still had that negative perception from the youth training scheme days. And so a lot of this constant issue of poor perception and feeling that technical education was second class, I think, was partly driven by that. So 1990s, under John Major, they started to be revived. Modern apprenticeships started to be designed. Numbers grew quite slowly to start with. It wasn't really until the government increased or allowed apprenticeships to move into the post-25 area that massive growth started to happen. One of my jobs in my old role was as we came towards the 2 millionth apprentice of the last government. This was obviously seen as a possible sort of PR coup. And so I had a short list of people who had started their apprenticeship on the day, because obviously we couldn't work out who was the first on that day. And so I made my little trip around the country to meet these lovely individuals and choose the person who was the 2 millionth apprentice. So it ended up as, you'll be unsurprised to know, a female engineer called Paige from Oxford, who was then sort of the poster person for apprenticeships. She did an absolutely wonderful job, and as one of the pieces of work that she did with us, we actually took her into a cabinet meeting, which was the first time that she was the youngest woman ever to address cabinet, and she talked a bit about her apprenticeship. And one of the things that one of the cabinet ministers asked her was, well, how can we get more women engineers? And she said, well, to start with, stop calling me a woman engineer. I'm an engineer, and the more you draw attention to it, the worse it will get. So she was a great candidate for that, because she was very, very charismatic, very clear, and certainly not afraid to tell ministers what she thought. In terms of that post-25 element, I think that, for me, is the biggest challenge of apprenticeships at the second. So volumes are growing, but the volumes have grown in particular in older apprentices and people who are already employed and are retraining through apprenticeships. Now, I think there is a place for that. Apprenticeships can be a useful product in particular circumstances, where somebody's been promoted into a new role, where somebody's moving from a generalist role in an institution to a specialist one, where somebody's coming back from maternity or paternity leave into a different career. There are particular instances. But my fear, particularly with the introduction of the levy, is that there'll be an incentive for employers to focus a lot of their levy money and their training on retraining and upskilling existing workforce, because they might as well use that money and not getting the best value, in a little bit of an echo of what we saw under Train to Gain. So in terms of the very latest on apprenticeships, the key reforms there echo some of the things we saw in 14 to 19. So a much greater focus on employers designing the standards for apprenticeship. So setting out on one or two sides of A4 what they think is needed for a particular job. The levy, so a tax on businesses with a payroll of over £3 million to fund the levy policy. Another great sleight of hand there, because government has been able to say that they're increasing the amount of funding on apprenticeships from about 1.6 billion to about 3 billion, but in reality, because that's a new tax, that full 3 billion will come from the levy. So in other words, they've saved the 1.6 billion that was previously coming from general expenditure. So a very sensible policy, but also a very convenient one in terms of the finances. And finally, the other sort of element of the apprenticeship change there is the creation of a new institute for apprenticeships. So the idea of an independent body that will safeguard quality, and that's really an attempt to try and once and for all get rid of the sort of negative connotations that came with the Morrison's apprenticeships that were sort of discovered about 5 or 6 years ago, short 6-week apprenticeships. Those no longer happen. There's a minimum duration of a year, but I think it's really important to government and to the sector that there's a sort of independent voice in quality that can ensure that and make sure that there are no other dips. So that's the sort of history and the chronology of technical education over the last 20 years. And what I'd like to do now is to sort of take a step back behind the scenes and think about how policy is made, because as I've said, some of the policies that have come up perhaps don't feel very logical or have sort of gone in different directions. So why have we got to that sort of position? Well, I thought it might be useful to think about it almost as a bit of a worked example. So one of the policies that has been announced recently, has been in the pipeline for about a couple of years, is a new public sector duty on apprenticeships. So the idea is that any public sector body, the Crown Courts, the Department for Education, schools themselves, will be under a duty to make sure that 2.7% of their workforce will be apprentices. So a very specific duty, first time that's been introduced, it will apply to the university as well, so it's sort of important on a local level too. So where does the idea for a new policy come from? Well, it can come from a variety of different places. International examples are a popular one, so ministers often go to other countries and come back with some scary new ideas that they want to import. Sometimes those can be imported with varying degrees of success. So Anne Hodgson talked a lot about the sort of difference between policy importing and policy implementing. So policy importing is where you simply try and take something and stick it in your system, and it very rarely works. Policy implementing, of course, is where you learn the lessons from other countries, but it's a much more nuanced approach and much less often used, I think. So that's one possible source of new ideas. Clearly, it's also new ideas, as we've seen, is the past. So looking to reinvigorate things that have been tried before in a slightly new way. Local ideas that can be nationalised, and in this case, that's probably the closest to what's there on public sector duty. So ministers and officials saw that some local authorities and some projects were doing this, were insisting that contractors and public sector bodies were employing a certain number of apprentices, and they thought, well, couldn't we do that for every single one? So I think that quite often happens as a policy route as well, seeing a local idea and then thinking about expanding it. I think one of the challenges with that, and that's one of the things I've seen most in this role at Edge, is the temptation is always to sort of have a national rollout of something in a very standardised way because it's administratively simple, and that very rarely works. So when I see a good project now, we're working with a wonderful project in Crewe. If I'd been in the department, the natural thing would have been to say, well, how can we have an X in every city? As we all know, that isn't always the best way of doing things because you need a much more locally nuanced approach. It doesn't really matter if the project doesn't have the same name in each city. It'd be much better if it was locally owned and locally understood. The final place that new ideas for policy comes from is out of the ether of ministers and special advisors' thoughts. People they've met, people in their constituency, policy papers they've read. So sometimes it happens that ministers simply had an idea and you need to find a way to deliver it, and that happens fairly often. So how is it developed? How are policy ideas developed? Well, a variety of different ways, increasingly sort of policy workshop type approaches. So again, in this instance of the public sector duty, we did a lot of cross-government workshops with the Cabinet Office, who have responsibility for procurement policy and the sort of civil service estate, and the education department and the business department. So that sort of workshop environment, I think, is quite common in terms of policy development. One of the buzzwords around Whitehall in the last sort of few years has been around open policy making. So trying to involve customers and external organisations a lot more in policy development, and that was certainly the case in a lot of the latest apprenticeship work. So bringing in focus groups of education and training providers, of employers, of apprentices themselves to try and comment on this policy and develop it as it went. And I think that can be quite a positive thing. I think it operates at its best when it happens in its most genuine form, and where consultation happens early on and can be developed. It works in its least good way when you've really already made the decision, and then you go and consult to try and make sure that it's all okay, not really sort of intending to take on board what's come out. Those interdepartmental discussions are interesting as well, because one of the challenges that I'll come on to say a bit about in a while is obviously that government departments have different views on things. So in this case, thinking about apprenticeships within public sector bodies, the education department and the business department simply wanted the most apprenticeships possible because they've got a target of 3 million apprenticeships. The Cabinet Office that I talked about earlier on clearly wants to safeguard value for money, is worried about civil service numbers shrinking. So very much different sort of viewpoints on the same issue. Seeking expert opinions. So this is an area that we were talking about beforehand, but is a particular bugbear of mine, really, that when I was in the department as a policy official, I very rarely had time or opportunity to read academic research and to really understand what it meant. And I think the temptation is always to make the policy decision and then find, the one or two experts that justify it. I think that can lead to an over-emphasis on particular experts. So Alison Wolfe obviously has cropped up many times over the last sort of 5 years within the technical education space, and she does some wonderful work, but I think it would be even better if there was a sort of broader spectrum of people in that space to try and just make sure that the sort of widest range of opinions is felt. There's also quite a strong emphasis within the civil service and within policymaking on sort of cross-disciplinary involvement as well. So involving people like lawyers, so this instance where we're talking about the new public sector target, that would require a change in legislation, so getting lawyers involved, communication specialists, analysts. And again, that's a sort of double-edged sword. So on the one hand, it's great to have those different opinions. On the other, I think sometimes I worry about divorcing some of those roles from the policy official. It means that, particularly on the analysis side actually, they tend not to do any of that themselves, and that can be a challenge. So I would like to see policy makers having more of the analytical skills themselves, reading more of the research themselves, rather than necessarily relying on professional statisticians or professional researchers to digest that for them, because I think that can dilute it, and it's a really important interface between policy and analysis. In terms of making decisions, two real routes. The sort of most traditional is the sort of civil service submission, so a very sort of standardised 2 or 3 page document that sets out the sort of range of options and asks the minister to make a decision. It's evolved a little bit over the last sort of 10 years, but really it's broadly the same as it ever was. So, the traditional Sir Humphrey type submission into the red box overnight, minister writes red pen comments on it, it comes back the next day and the decision's been made. I think the most enlightened ministers have moved on a bit from that, so they're doing much more in the way of discursive decision making, so tending to have short meetings with officials to discuss options, send them away to do further work, and then sort of make an iterative set of decisions in that sort of way. But as I've said, that's been, I think, quite a slow process in the civil service. And then finally, the sort of communication implementation phase. So in this case, once ministers had decided about the public sector target, there was a statutory consultation. So they had to consult those who were going to be affected by it. They didn't have to take on board what they said, but they had to consult them and they had to publish a response to that consultation. They had to legislate, so legislation to enact that policy. They had to negotiate with other bodies, most notably the devolved administrations who have their own responsibility for education policy. And then they had to work out how to monitor that duty as well. So hopefully that's helped in terms of just thinking about behind the scenes the sort of process that goes on to make some of those decisions. What that leads me on to then think about is why that doesn't go right in all instances, and the sort of influences that can throw us off kilter in terms of how those decisions are made. I think the first thing to say is, no matter what their political persuasion, ministers are tend to be lovely people. They tend to be very hardworking. They really want to make a difference. So the problem isn't that they're trying to make things worse, and yet sometimes that's what happens. So there must be something going wrong in that black box in the middle. I think for me, one of the biggest influences in this area, and one of the biggest challenges, I think, is purely that pattern of the electoral cycle and the change of ministers even within that. So obviously electoral cycle 5 years, but in this area of technical education, we've tended to have at least one reshuffle in the middle, so perhaps 3 years of a sort of skills minister. And that's really not a lot of time to get up to speed, to make decisions and enact them, and then obviously to see the impact of them. Remember, going back to Tomlinson, that he said that it would take 10 years to deliver the reforms that he suggested, which I think is sensible / a slight underestimate. So if you've got only 2 or 3 years to prove your political credentials, you've got to find things to change that are quicker than that in order to show that you've made a difference. And I think that is a constant challenge. There was a really excellent report that City and Guilds commissioned last year looking at the technical and professional education system, which showed the sheer number of different ministers who've been involved, the sheer number of different policy changes that had happened, and that constant sense of endless revolution, really, which I think can be quite tiring for all players, but in particular it can be really tiring for practitioners who are constantly rushing from one initiative to the next. But it can also be really tiring for people like employers. So, as I've said, I think involving employers in the development and delivery of these things is crucial. But if you go back to them year on year on year to say, actually, we've got rid of those ones, so can you help with this next one? And we've got rid of those, so can you help with the next one? It can really sort of start to grate. I think the government is coming up for a real challenge on that particular issue with the new T-levels. So employers have been involved, as I mentioned, in the development of apprenticeships through panels that have designed the standards. Through the new Sainsbury review process, the idea is that panels of employers will also design the standards for those routes. And I think the conversation is going to be hard when the officials go back to those employers to say, thanks very much for spending 2 years designing the apprenticeship. We now would like you to design something that looks very similar but slightly different for the sort of college-based version. So I think that electoral cycle, that constant change, just creates a really tough situation actually for ministers trying to prove themselves in a very short amount of time. That's actually mirrored by a similar challenge within the civil service. So the typical sort of period before you're encouraged to move on to a new post, it tends to be about 3 years, 2 to 3 years. And if you're still there after 4 or 5 years, people are starting to say, well, you've been here a long time. Are you going to be moving on soon? And I think that, again, is a real challenge because it really dissipates the institutional memory. So as we've seen, there's been a real cyclical change in some of these areas, diplomas and then Sainsbury Review coming back and the routes looking very like the diploma lines. And it's no real surprise because so few people have stayed in the same sort of area than they were. Often they've moved to different departments or different areas of the same department. And so that constant encouragement, obviously there's a rationale for it in the sense of getting a broad base and getting people to move between policy areas. But actually there shouldn't be a stigma attached to being a bit more specialist. And one of the reasons that I've moved to the Edge Foundation is that I really wanted to stay working on teenagers, working on vocational education, and to sort of be able to specialise in that. I think one of the other challenges for ministers is the sheer number of different roles that they play. So, and the sheer number of influences on them and the people they need to keep happy. So if you take a typical sort of second rank skills minister, they've got their own Secretary of State to keep happy, or in the case of the skills minister over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, they've had 2 Secretaries of State to keep happy because they've tended to be a joint post between business and education. Obviously that's not the case with the joint department now. They've got number 10 to keep happy, and you've been seeing in the news recently the challenge of grammar schools. It's quite clear that Justine Greening isn't as enthusiastic about grammar schools as the Prime Minister, but she's got to tread that walk very carefully. So that's always on their mind. They're trying to make a difference within those 2 to 3 years, as we've touched on. They've got their constituency role, so they need to be seen as a good constituency MP. So if they're Education Secretary, but they've also got grammar schools in their patch or not got grammar schools in their patch, that might be on their minds because they've got to keep local people happy. They've got their role in the House of Commons to think about as well, so keeping backbenchers involved, their oratory, their parliamentary questions, their bill debates. And then they've got their work with external organisations as well, so charities that they might be involved in. And I think that makes the position challenging as well because often I've seen it that we've got to a particular point in policy making and something comes from left field to change the minister's mind or to be an extra view. So they've had a meeting with a particular person in their constituency, they've met with a particular charity that has sort of swayed them to think differently, and that can increase again that level of flux in the system because it means that it's much more tempting to change tack partway through a policy decision. This one's linked to that sort of short electoral cycle, but there's this need to constantly make a discernible difference. So I think you don't want to be the minister who's kept a steady ship, who's implemented things that were designed by somebody else. You want to be the minister that came up with the new idea, and again that can be a real challenge because it sort of immediately injects that sense of constant revolution. We talked about patchiness, so that sense that there's something innately wrong with things that are patchy or different in different areas. It's sort of a sort of desire to be administratively tidy, which you can sort of understand in the civil service, and I've felt it myself. You want things to fit nicely into boxes and have a single program with a single name, but often that isn't the right way to go. And I think that tidiness can stifle innovation locally and can stifle the best outcome for particular local areas. And we've touched on this briefly as well, but there are real challenges with importing policies from different countries. So often we can miss the rationale. So the apprenticeship levy is a good one here. So countries like Switzerland and Germany have an apprenticeship levy, but they have an apprenticeship levy because employers see the real value in training, and they choose through their industry bodies to put the money in to get the training out. We've seen that here and thought that looks very good. Let's import that. We'll tax employers. So on the surface of it, you've got the same system, but the incentive structure is set up in a completely different way because here employers feel that it's been imposed, and therefore employers are thinking about the best way to get their money back, and that doesn't necessarily mean the best outcome in terms of skills. It might mean that they do more retraining of existing staff, as I've said. It might mean that they do higher level apprenticeships because they cost more, rather than necessarily thinking about apprenticeships being for entry level students and young people aged 16 to 24. Number 10 is always a challenge, but the particular challenge that I wanted to highlight is around this quest for sort of headlines and hooks. So I touched on the 2 millionth apprentice as an example earlier on. There's a real focus on numbers, always numbers. So the 2 millionth apprentice, 3 million apprenticeships this parliament. In a way, there's always a temptation to sacrifice something that is that makes things undeliverable just to get a bit of a punchy headline this time. And you see that again and again whenever there's a sort of numerical announcement. And if you look back, there was an exercise done at the end of the last Labour government looking at all of the numerical commitments that have been made and whether they've been met. And obviously many of them hadn't on things like housing and immigration and all the rest of it. But in general, they managed to get away with it. There wasn't a lot of publicisation of the ones that hadn't been met. So that constant desire for news headlines, particularly numerical ones, can be a real challenge too. I've touched on this, but different parts of government pulling in different directions can also really challenge policy. So to give an example, between the business department and the education department, through the levy, obviously, and through the public sector duty, schools are caught by both of those. So there's a desire for schools to do more in the way of apprenticeships. Obviously, one of the challenges for schools is that there's a limited number of roles within a school that you can be an apprentice in. And so the business department, being responsible for apprenticeships, thought, well, wouldn't it be great if teachers could be apprentices? Because then they'd be apprentice teachers, they'd be apprentices, and the young people would see them being apprentices. That all seems to work really nicely. But then the education department thought, oh, well, but teaching is a graduate profession. We've been pushing much for professionalism. Not sure that would work. So there's there's often a real sort of tension between different views and different ways that they're pulling, I think. So I think all of those different challenges lead to two sort of central issues that make it much harder to make good technical education policy. The first of those is the constant flux. So we've seen all of those add up to people constantly moving and the system constantly changing, and that sort of that feeling of constant revolution is a real challenge, I think. The other one that we've touched on a bit is this parity of esteem issue. So there's a long-standing, I think, cultural snobbery around technical education that exists here that doesn't exist in continental countries, and that is something that is really hard to get over. There's no easy way to do it. I think there has been a shift on apprenticeships specifically over the last sort of 5 years from a position where people thought that apprenticeships were just no good, and that was fueled by the sort of Morrison's short apprenticeship issue, and by the fact that the generation of people who were parents had grown up in the times of youth training scheme when apprenticeships genuinely weren't there or weren't any good. I think it's now moved on to a situation where the general message is apprenticeships are good, but not for my child. So that is one step forward, but we need to now ideally take the final step, which is obviously apprenticeships are good, and I would be happy for my child to do it. I think the tide is moving in that direction if we can keep the tide going, because the advent of degree apprenticeships and higher apprenticeships, the start of apprenticeships in real blue chip companies, you know, Googles, Barclays, Lloyds of this world, are starting to change parents' perceptions of apprenticeships for their children. And actually one of the interesting things I've found is that one of the highest rates of queries about apprenticeship information comes from private schools now. So the sort of the middle class parents are starting to think about and colonise the apprenticeship market. So who knows, there might be a change in that vein over the next few years. But certainly the sort of parity of esteem argument has been a real change. Interestingly, if you look internationally, there are examples of systems that have really stuck with duration and it's really worked. So it's only a very small example, but I was over in Jersey a few months ago because they're doing some work to set up an education business partnership there. They've had a work experience program there called Trident that they've been running for 30 years. And it's basically unchanged. They've tweaked it a little bit. But one of the things they've really found is that the people they're now approaching in their local businesses, because it existed when they were at school, they immediately get it and they say, oh yeah, of course, I did that when I was young and I want to give that and I want to give back. So that's an extreme example in terms of the sort of 30 years, but there is something to be said for some stability in some of the core of this that means that there's a currency to the brand and a sort of cultural understanding of what's going on. So to sort of finish, I wanted to talk a bit about the way forward and in two respects. Firstly, what I think we should change about policy, and then secondly, what I think we should change about the policy-making process. So in terms of the sort of technical education policy, I think there has been a lot of positive change in recent years. Some of the work to expand and improve apprenticeships is definitely really exciting and starts to build parity, I think, with some of the best systems in the world. I think nobody's in any doubt that we need more employer interventions in schools. So the literature is clear, the research is clear that helps to improve people's life chances and people's incomes later on. I think the key thing is how we do that. So the challenges we've seen is that the money from connections never went into schools, and so for most schools they don't have a dedicated resource to do that. But some schools have found a way to do it. So to give an example, there's a very innovative free school called School 21 in the East End of London in Stratford. And they really think that these employer interventions are absolutely crucial. And so they teach one fewer GCSEs than they could otherwise. So they do 8 rather than 9. And they invest the money that they would have put into that GCSE into employer engagement. So they call that their 9th GCSE. And so they use those staff to work with local employers, to build those bases, and they send all of their year 10s out to do a practical project with an employer as basically one lesson a week over the entire year. And interestingly for them, it's key that those projects are real projects. So they're not simulated, they're not business investigation. They, for instance, went into HSBC and were helping them to redesign the way that they market and develop accounts for young people. They went into a local restaurant and they helped them to redesign their children's menus. They worked with the chef to understand the costs of the ingredients. They designed the dishes, they cooked them with the chef, and then they redesigned the menu. So it's about sort of having real value to that work, which I think is quite an interesting way of doing it. I think for me, one of the crucial things that needs to happen is to go back to that element of Tomlinson that is about 14 to 19. So I think now more than ever, as we think about Brexit, about the skills gaps that exist, young people need that extended period of 14 to 19 education as a unified whole to get ready for work, to have those employer engagements, to have the core curriculum, but also to have the sort of vocational options as well. I think we need the breadth of curriculum, so the current EBAC is too narrow. We need to broaden that and allow people to have creative and technical options within it so that they can do design and technology, PE, drama, the subjects that capture their talent, that make them inspired and that mean that they want to do the other core elements of the syllabus. Project-based working, I think, is really important. I've touched on that. And finally, I think the other major change that I would advocate is very much around the accountability system. So at the moment that drives so much of what schools do, but it's so focused on very technical measures that very few people understand. Progress 8, attainment 8, how many parents look at those and really, really understand them. I think for me, within those performance tables, there's one particular measure that stands out, and it's the one that gets the least attention, but it's the most important, and that's the destination measures. So if a school's doing really well, what you'd want to see is the pupils from that school going on to positive destinations, whether that's apprenticeships, university, and jobs. That data exists now in a better way than it's ever existed before, and yet it's, you know, a footnote to the performance tables, when for me it should be the sort of first thing that we or that parents look at. And just to finish on the changes to policy, I think there's a real example of how this could work over in the States. So we were over visiting Nashville a few weeks ago, and what they've done there, they 10 years ago they had one of the lowest high school graduation rates in the United States, and essentially the businesses in the area got together and said, well, this is no good. We can't import the labour that we need. We have to have homegrown talent, and the schools aren't producing it. So it was very much sort of pushed by the local businesses to say that they needed to change. And what they changed was they looked at their high schools, so for 14 to 19-year-olds, and they said what we need is the opportunity to be much more vocationally focused on a particular area, because that will inspire young people. So when young people go into their first year of high school, they enter what they call the freshman academy, and that year is all about helping them to make a successful choice about their future career. So they spend time building the skills they need to learn, and they spend time investigating different careers. That might be through being mentored by older students, by going on employer visits, by going to careers fairs, by investigating different career roles. So that at the end of that year, they can make an informed choice about which academy they go into. And then for the final 3 years of their high school, they go into a career academy that's associated with a particular industry. So there's a wide variety. There's 40 different ones in Nashville, from aviation to law to digital to town planning, and that career academy sort of flavours or brings a lens to all of the different elements of their school life. They'll take a technical qualification in that area. They'll do work experience in that area. But most interestingly, it also flavours the sort of core curriculum. So if they're in the aviation academy, they will learn maths through thinking about thrust and flight and aerodynamics. If they're in the medical one, they'll think about it through titration and the amount of insulin you might need to give a patient. It gives much more relevance to the curriculum, and the results speak for themselves. Their high school graduation rates have gone from 57% to 82% over the last 10 years, so a massive increase. And it's had all sorts of other positive impacts. The number of exclusions and suspensions has gone through the floor, and generally young people are a lot more engaged in their education. So very finally, just think about the future of policy making and the way that I think that might change to be better in this area. I think the first thing that we've got to tackle is that constant revolution, and I think actually if you look at things like the manifestos from the last election, the level of congruence between the three parties is startling. So there was a bit of an arms race in terms of the number of apprenticeships, but in general everyone thought they were good and wanted more of them. And I think the more we can move towards greater cross-party consensus on particular elements of technical education, the better, because I think it will give people the certainty and it'll help to start to erase that memory of the 14 to 19 diploma issue, where people put in all that work and then the rug was pulled, because it gives you that sort of certainty. And if, as Tomlinson says, and the Nashville example illustrates as well, it takes 10 years to fix this problem, we're going to need to buy ourselves 10 years to focus on a particular way of doing this if we have any hope of making a real difference. I think the second thing I'd say about policy making is that there needs to be a much greater focus on how things are taught rather than institutional change. Now, in a way, this comes from the fact that ministers need to be seen to make a difference, because the easiest thing to be seen to make a difference to is institutions, because you can change them relatively quickly. You can open new schools, you can close new schools, you can start a new type of school. It's much harder to change pedagogy, or even really qualifications or the syllabus. And so I think for me, we need to try and turn that pyramid upside down and think particularly about the way things are taught, project-based learning, new styles of curriculum, inspiring teachers, more than about perhaps the institutional type. And I think the final one, and this, as Paul knows, is a particular theme of mine, is a better link between analysis and policy making. So trying to improve the way that analysts and academics write in a way that's accessible to policymakers, trying to improve the willingness and the time taken by policymakers to read and understand that analysis. Because I think otherwise we end up making this cyclical nature of coming back again and again, reinventing the wheel in a way that's frustrating to both sides. So I hope you found that interesting. That was my my plan for success.
Okay, everybody. Well, obviously, a big thank you to Olly first of all, providing that historical context to explain how we've arrived at where we are now. I found it fascinating too that haphazardness that goes on with regard to policy making. That was quite clear that what came through there. And then the proposals you were putting forward with regards to more employee engagement, that's obviously key. Certainly from the contacts I've had with the university technical colleges, that makes a huge difference, right? From the point of view of the students involved actually recognise there's a real purpose to what they are doing. It's not just purely something brought in. It's not one day release. It's actually focusing on a real world problem that they've been asked to deal with.
So just on that, Paul, there's one quote that stuck in my head. So when we were in Nashville, we talked to one of the head teachers out there, and he said to me, look, kids don't like English and maths any more than they did 10 years ago, but now they see the relevance of it, so they try and they get the qualifications. Which I thought was interesting. It wasn't the case that they, he wasn't painting a picture of a complete mindset change. No. It was purely that relevance that because they'd been into an engineering company and spent time with them, or they'd been into a health situation and used it.
That was the thing that underpinned everything in the diplomas.
Exactly.
You weren't teaching maths, you were teaching
contextualised
a subject which was relevant, and the maths came in.
Absolutely.
So any questions to Ollie from some of the many issues he's raised?
There's so many I could ask. One quick one. You said people go abroad and they get ideas and they come back.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever been abroad and asked them what they think is good about our system, and then build on that? Because I can see things which other countries have said, hey, that's really great.
Yeah.
And then lo and behold, a minister comes along and scraps it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a really good point, and that is often a conundrum. So we're seeing that at the moment with studio schools. So the government here has put a moratorium on more studio schools, and isn't being very supportive of that movement. And yet OECD have said that it's one of the most exciting models they've ever seen. International case people are coming over every week to see it and to borrow the model. So you're absolutely right. There's that weird dichotomy. One of the things that I'm quite keen to look at more is the received wisdom in this area tends to be, well, the continental countries, particularly the central continental countries, have got it right. Switzerland is great, Germany's great, so let's do what they do. And I have some sympathy with that, but the institutional mechanisms that sit beneath the system in those countries are so different from ours that it's very difficult to import. So I think we need to build a much bigger body of evidence around the Anglo-Saxon countries, particularly Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the US, because I think that the things that we gather from those countries and that we export are much more easily fittable than something from Germany or Switzerland.
The other question is, you're talking about changing policy making. Isn't there a strong case for getting ministers out of this and having them at an arm's length? Because if you're going to have something, when you talked about, you mentioned Germany and Switzerland, at least you wouldn't have the changes going. I mean, I don't know the Swiss system, I don't know the German system. This sort of mucking around with vocational education wouldn't happen in Germany because the employers are in there and they've got the clout, and they would, and it's not just the big employers; it's also the craft level people. They're in through their own chambers and everything else. They've got all that institutional structure.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that in this country, ministers can muck around with vocational education and nobody bats an eyelid. If they start wanting to close a hospital, we have, people out on the streets. It's partly because, it's always been a Cinderella area.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. One of the interesting things, again, from the Nashville example was we were talking to them about how things happen when their superintendent of education changes, and they say, well, when the new superintendent changes, the chair of the Chamber of Commerce sits them down and says, look, we've been doing this for 10 years, it's working really well, don't change it. And we don't have anyone to do that here. And so I think that could be a very powerful model. I think for me, the sort of trying to get cross-party support for some elements of this is another way to try and crack that same nut. The more you can get consensus around particular elements, the more safety you can provide to the sector to say, this is a route that we're going to follow for a good number of years.
Question?
Where are we up to with BTECs? Are they still vocational? Are they academic? Are they now the closest thing that we've got to the diplomas? It seems they've been moved around in the sort of 30 years that I've been involved in this.
Yeah, good question. So BTEC still exists. They're still a really good product. They're obviously owned by Pearson, so they're a particular brand of vocational qualifications.
Sorry, you say they're owned by Pearson?
Yeah, exactly. So
right.
I when I started this role, I hadn't really realised that either, because they're such a sort of broadly understood term, but they are as a qualification that is owned by a particular awarding body. I think one of the things that's changed about that whole space is that the department's taking a much closer interest in which of those qualifications count for performance tables. So although schools are able to offer any of the qualifications they think would suit their young people in nominal terms, only the ones on the approved list from the department will count for performance tables. So there's a really strong incentive for schools to only teach the ones that will count, because otherwise it will effectively count against them in performance tables. So whilst that full suite of options is available, there's been a sort of migration to only focus on the ones that are approved. And the ones that are approved tend to be the ones that are either seen as more rigorous, that rigor word again, but you know the way that is measured is is perhaps difficult, or the ones that have got approval from universities or from business. So general qualifications and tech levels are the sort of badges that the department gives to those qualifications that have been signed off by a particular number of employers or a particular number of universities to show that they're relevant and good. So I think the answer is they're still there, they're still relevant. BTEC in particular, I think, is a really strong brand. And 1 in 4 people who went to university last year had a BTEC as well, including or as well as A levels. So they're still very much there and a growing brand, I think. But you just need to be careful at school level about which ones count in order to not negatively influence performance tables.
John, yeah.
I really enjoyed that, thank you very much. And I was comparing it, we had a talk last night which was about integration between health and social care.
Oh, interesting.
So for me, and maybe I'm the only one, well, I was the only one who was there, but were you here last night? There were really interesting parallels. Just leave that for a moment. I wondered if you'd share with us, I'm not asking for kind of gossipy insights, but one of the things that struck me was that part of the challenge you're describing is whether ministers and policymakers, and indeed ourselves, are able to engage in a conversation which is about what a 10-year horizon planning would look like. Connections, I think, is a good example about a solution, I think, not to guidance for children who are going to get a place in university, but it was about the huge percentage of children, young people, that are not well served by the education system. And so you're trying to create something to address a problem for which there's not much kind of political capital necessarily. So it's those issues of how do you integrate and use the resources that you have in a way to address something for which there is not necessarily great political mileage out there. And I just wondered, from your experience of being on the inside, whether there's a willingness to kind of understand and appreciate that's a huge challenge actually, because you're being asked to do something for which you won't see the benefit if you're a minister.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting point. I think there's sort of 2 bits to what you're asking. There's a bit about how do you get focus in an area that is less glamorous? As you were saying, like you're never going to get as much political capital out of young people who are neat or teenage parents as you will out of gifted and talented kids who are going to go to Oxbridge. I think part of the skill of policymakers is to try and nurture their policy in a way that fits with the overall rhetoric of the government. So a good example is obviously with Theresa May's arrival, social mobility has become the sort of key buzzword around Whitehall. And so I suspect there's a lot of thinking going on around the vocational space about, and actually it lends itself to this, so we're lucky, about how to fit in with that new rhetoric. So obviously, Brexit is another example. So as those sort of themes emerge of the particular government, trying to make sure that your policy is at the forefront of that. So showing that the number of EU nationals working in the NHS is 11%, so we're going to need to refresh that cadre, so therefore skills policy is really important, or showing that young people who from poorer backgrounds are much more likely to go into technical education and have poorer outcomes, so we definitely need to do something on that for social mobility. So I think there's definitely something in that sort of arc. In terms of the 10-year strategy and the sort of longer term stuff, it's a much harder thing to do, I think again, one of the things that the outside world has been a bit burnt by in the past is when government does publish a 5 or 10-year strategy, it's only a year or two later that they publish the next 5 or 10-year strategy, so you never get to see the sort of 10 years out. I think to have any hope of getting there, I think we need to start to change some of the underlying conditions, as we were sort of saying, whether that's whether that's more cross-party support to give you that longer time frame, or a willingness to for a government to really stick their neck out on a particular policy. I think one of the things that can really help us internationally is if there's a really strong evidence base for something, then that can help us to sort of give ministers and others the confidence to put a bit more time into something. Nashville's a good example. It's taken 10 years to get that rise, but actually if you look at the pattern, it's by no means like a year-on-year increase. They went up a bit, they plateaued, they went up a bit, they plateaued, and I think if that had been the UK context, as soon as they hit the plateau, it would have got binned, exactly. And actually it was only the willingness to accept that it was going to take a while and we're going to stick to it that got there, and I think that is going to take quite a cultural change.
Sure, John, yes, go ahead.
So it's what you seem to be saying, and I think if I understood correctly, I agree with you, that one of the challenges we have is not so much ministers coming and going in their ideological preferences, but the complicity of some of us in responding to their agendas and framing things in terms of what we think they want to hear.
Yes, that's a very good
and we kind of position ourselves around that.
Yeah.
And that as long as we're kind of engaged in that, the cycle gets repeated, doesn't it?
I think that's right. That's absolutely right. One of the civil servants I've respected most over the years was a Director General that I worked for several years ago, and she said that the most important factor as a civil servant was to be able to speak truth under power. So to have the courage of your convictions when you're sitting in front of somebody who is very important and has a lot of power in lots of different ways, and be able to say, actually, Minister, the evidence says the opposite of what you're saying. And that's a really hard thing to do, but that's essentially exactly what you're saying. Collectively, that's what we need to do.
Well, there's another problem with this, which is, as we were saying before, it's very hard to get two academics to agree on anything in their field.
No, it isn't.
And I think politicians might be a bit better than we are generally about clubbing together on the core things, the things that we would definitely agree on, and distinguishing those from things which are not quite so important, because what we will do in our work very often is try to critique. In other words, that's sort of how we go about things, critiquing other people. But I think sometimes we're not quite so good at possibly finding where we do agree to present to outside people beyond, and policymakers, and for every expert. You can find half a dozen other experts in that field who wish that they had been the ones who have been favoured by policymakers.
I think that's a really powerful point, and I think you've hit on something really important, which is almost about finding academics and analysts finding a second voice. So I think there's one set of arguments and one way of doing things which is done almost behind closed doors. So in academic circles, critiquing each other, having that debate is absolutely healthy, and that's the way that the whole system works. But if you put policymakers into that, they'll just be confused by the maelstrom of different viewpoints, and they'll come away and think, well, I didn't really get much out of that. Where, let's just make a decision and go one way. So I think it's about finding that second voice, which is having had that internal debate, how do you then, as you say, put together in a really simple way what the balance of evidence says, and there might be the odd dissenting point or caveat, but the sort of overwhelming weight of evidence in a particular way. And as we were saying earlier, there are some areas that lend themselves better to that than others, where the weight of evidence is very strongly, for a breadth of curriculum rather than EBAC, for example. Whereas in other areas, like the grading structure behind GCSEs, there's tons of different viewpoints, and it'll be very difficult. But I think absolutely one of the things that as a cadre of academics, we need to sort of develop more is that way of talking to policymakers, and similarly policymakers need to develop a much more sensitive and an open way of talking to academics, rather than thinking, well, I need some analysis to justify this particular policy. I'll go and ask my pet statistician to find the nearest academic who agrees with me, and then we can use that to justify it, which I'm afraid is sometimes the way that the system works.
And that model you're describing there isn't just applicable to technical education.
No,
it could be
absolutely.
applicable to a whole range of policy areas, couldn't it?
Yeah, across social policy, health.
Absolutely, having those academics who have come with a second voice, who have been able to, as far as possible, influence policymakers with a certain amount of clarity.
Absolutely.
Okay, right, that's 7:15, everybody. That's terrific. So just a big thank you to Olly on your part for taking the time out to do that preparation for this evening and to deliver it what I thought in such a coherent, clear way. And you know, that kind of 40-45 minutes just flew as far as I was concerned. So thanks ever so much.
Thanks everyone. It's been a pleasure.